The morning started like any other Tuesday until I saw two men in cheap polo shirts standing on my front porch, clipboards in hand and plastic badges dangling from their necks like discount jewelry. One of them held up what looked like a laminated identification card and announced through my screen door that I was in violation of multiple HOA regulations. The other one had his phone out, recording everything as if he were conducting some sort of official investigation. I was still holding my coffee mug, wondering if this was some elaborate prank, when the first man declared with all the authority he could muster that I needed to step outside immediately to discuss my numerous infractions. That's when my wife Sarah appeared at the door behind me, car keys in her hand and her Federal Bureau of Investigation credentials clipped to her belt. She didn't say a word at first, just stood there with that calm professional demeanor she'd perfected over 15 years of law enforcement. The two men on our porch took one look at her badge and their entire performance crumbled like a house of cards in a windstorm. The one with the phone nearly dropped it as he stumbled backward, while his partner mumbled something about having the wrong address before they both practically sprinted to a silver sedan waiting at the curb. My name is David Mitchell, and I live in Greenfield Commons, a subdivision where the grass is required to be exactly 2 3/4 inches tall and the mailbox posts must be painted in one of 3 approved colors. It's the kind of neighborhood where people move to escape drama, only to discover that drama has a way of finding you regardless, especially when it comes wearing a HOA president's badge and carrying a 3-ring binder full of complaints. I work as an accountant for a small firm downtown, keep my yard neat without obsessing over it, and generally mind my own business. Sarah and I bought our house here 5 years ago because we wanted a quiet place to raise our daughter Emma, who's now 7 and has inherited her mother's no-nonsense attitude and my tendency to ask too many questions. We figured a well-maintained neighborhood with reasonable rules would be perfect for us. We had no idea we were moving into the personal fiefdom of Margaret Paulson. Margaret had been the HOA president for 8 years running, not because she was particularly qualified or well-liked, but because she was the only person willing to attend every meeting, read every bylaw, and turn neighborhood management into a full-time occupation. She was a retired bank manager in her early 60s, with steel gray hair always pulled back in a tight bun and reading glasses that seemed to exist solely for looking down at people over them. Margaret treated the homeowners association like her personal kingdom, and the rest of us like subjects who needed constant supervision. The trouble started small, as these things usually do. 3 months ago, I received my first official notice from the HOA, printed on letterhead that Margaret had apparently designed herself, complete with a gold seal sticker and formal language that made my minor trash can placement sound like a federal crime. According to the letter, I had violated Section 4.7 of the Community Guidelines by leaving my garbage bins visible from the street for more than 12 hours after collection. The fine was $25, payable within 10 business days. I paid the fine without argument, figuring it was easier than fighting over something so trivial. That was my first mistake. Margaret interpreted my compliance not as courtesy but as admission of guilt and weakness. The letters started arriving weekly after that, each one more ridiculous than the last. My garden hose was coiled in a non-approved manner. My daughter's chalk drawings on our driveway constituted unauthorized decorative modifications. The small American flag I'd mounted beside our front door was apparently 3 inches too large according to the patriotic display regulations I didn't know existed. Each violation came with its own fine, ranging from $15 for minor infractions to $75 for what Margaret deemed serious aesthetic disruptions. When I finally attended a HOA meeting to address the constant stream of penalties, I discovered that Margaret had appointed herself as both the primary enforcement officer and the appeals board. She sat at the head of a folding table in the community center, surrounded by a stack of binders and a handful of neighbors who seemed more interested in the free cookies than the proceedings. Margaret's enforcement strategy became increasingly creative as the weeks passed. She instituted daily neighborhood patrols, walking the streets with a clipboard and digital camera, documenting every perceived violation with the dedication of a forensic photographer. She measured lawn heights with a ruler, counted the number of decorative items on porches, and even monitored the exact times when residents brought in their mail. The woman had apparently memorized every subsection of every rule, and could cite specific violations from memory. When I questioned the legitimacy of some of her more obscure interpretations during one meeting, Margaret responded by creating new rules specifically designed to target my household. Suddenly there were regulations about the acceptable types of outdoor lighting, restrictions on the colors of doormats, and a prohibition on children's toys being visible from the street for more than 4 hours per day. She presented these additions to the board as necessary updates to maintain property values, and the other members, intimidated by her binder full of documentation, simply nodded their approval. The situation escalated when Margaret decided that written warnings weren't sufficient. She began showing up at my house personally, usually around dinner time, to discuss violations in person. These visits always followed the same pattern. She would stand on our porch with her clipboard, reading from a prepared script about community standards and property values, while I listened politely and agreed to address whatever minor issues she'd identified. Sarah usually stayed inside during these encounters, but I could see her watching through the window with growing irritation. Margaret's personal visits evolved into what she called compliance inspections, where she would walk around our property taking photographs and making notes about potential violations. She measured the height of our fence, counted the number of plants in our flower beds, and even examined our outdoor electrical outlets to ensure they met some standard she'd apparently invented. When I pointed out that these inspections weren't mentioned anywhere in the HOA bylaws, she produced a laminated card, identifying herself as an authorized community compliance officer, and claimed she had the right to inspect any property for violations. The breaking point came when Margaret decided that standard HOA procedures weren't moving fast enough. She recruited 2 men from somewhere, equipped them with official-looking identification badges, and began sending them to conduct what she called enforcement visits on her behalf. These weren't licensed professionals or even HOA board members, just 2 guys who seemed eager to play authority figure for whatever Margaret was paying them. They would show up at houses throughout the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, demanding immediate compliance with violations that often existed only in Margaret's imagination. The first time they visited our house, I wasn't home. Sarah answered the door and politely informed them that she wasn't familiar with any outstanding violations and asked them to provide documentation of their authority to conduct inspections. They couldn't produce anything beyond their homemade badges and a printed list of complaints, so Sarah asked them to leave and contact us through proper HOA channels. They left, but not before taking several photographs of our house and making what appeared to be threatening comments about the consequences of non-cooperation. Their second visit was more aggressive. They arrived early on a Saturday morning while Emma was playing in our front yard, and immediately began questioning her about whether we had permission for her playground equipment. When I came outside to see what was happening, they launched into a rehearsed speech about community standards and my obligation to comply with enforcement procedures. One of them actually attempted to hand me a document that looked like some sort of citation, complete with official-sounding language about penalties and mandatory compliance meetings. I refused to accept their fake citation and asked them to leave our property immediately. That's when things got interesting. The taller of the 2 men, who seemed to be the designated spokesman, informed me that I was now in violation of the cooperation clause and that my refusal to participate in the enforcement process would result in additional fines and possible legal action. His partner started taking more photographs, focusing on areas of our house and yard that were perfectly normal but that Margaret had apparently identified as problematic. When I insisted that they had no legal authority to issue citations or conduct inspections, they produced their phones and threatened to call the police to report my non-compliance. The irony was delicious. 2 men with no actual authority threatening to involve real law enforcement because I wouldn't pretend their fake authority was legitimate. I told them to go ahead and make that call, secretly hoping they would follow through so we could get some actual authorities involved in Margaret's increasingly bizarre enforcement schemes. They didn't call the police that day, but they did return the following week with backup. Margaret herself accompanied them this time, armed with what appeared to be a complete file of every interaction we'd had over the past several months. She announced that this was an official compliance inspection, and that my continued resistance to HOA procedures had resulted in the accumulation of over $800 in fines and penalties. She demanded immediate payment and presented me with a payment plan that would have had me sending her checks for the next 6 months. That's when I made my own call. I contacted the real police department and asked about the legality of private citizens conducting enforcement activities and issuing fines for property violations. The officer I spoke with was very helpful in explaining that what Margaret and her assistants were doing bordered on harassment, and that their fake citations had no legal standing whatsoever. He suggested that if they continued to show up at my house making demands and threats, I should call 911 and report them for trespassing and intimidation. Armed with this information, I decided to attend the next HOA meeting and address Margaret's enforcement tactics publicly. The community center was more crowded than usual. Apparently word had spread about Margaret's aggressive new approach and other residents wanted to voice their concerns as well. Margaret, however, was prepared for opposition. She had arranged the room so that she sat elevated at the front, with her enforcement assistants flanking her like bodyguards, and a microphone that only she seemed authorized to use. Margaret opened the meeting by announcing new emergency measures to address what she called a growing compliance crisis in the neighborhood. According to her presentation, property values were under threat from residents who refused to maintain community standards, and immediate action was required to prevent further deterioration. She introduced her compliance team as certified enforcement professionals and announced that they would be conducting comprehensive inspections of every property in the subdivision over the next month. When I raised my hand to ask about the legal authority for these inspections, Margaret responded by reading from a prepared statement about the importance of community cooperation and the consequences of disruptive behavior during official HOA proceedings. She then moved on to the next item on her agenda without acknowledging my question or allowing me to speak further. Several other residents tried to raise similar concerns, but Margaret effectively controlled the entire meeting through her monopoly on the microphone and her ability to declare any opposition out of order. The meeting ended with Margaret announcing that compliance inspections would begin the following Monday and that any resident who refused to cooperate would face escalating penalties up to and including legal action to force compliance. She distributed printed schedules showing when each house would be inspected and what areas would be examined. Our house was scheduled for the first day, apparently as an example to the rest of the neighborhood about the consequences of questioning Margaret's authority. Monday morning arrived with Margaret and her 2 assistants showing up at our front door precisely at 9 a.m., clipboards ready and cameras in hand. Margaret announced that this was an official compliance inspection and that we were required by HOA bylaws to allow access to all exterior areas of our property. When I asked to see the specific bylaw that granted her this authority, she produced her 3-ring binder and began reading from a section about community standards that mentioned nothing about mandatory inspections or access rights. I politely informed Margaret that while I respected the HOA's legitimate authority to enforce reasonable community standards, I didn't recognize her right to conduct searches of my property or to authorize non-residents to do so on her behalf. Her response was to have one of her assistants call what she claimed was the HOA's legal counsel to report my non-compliance. The assistant spent several minutes on the phone with someone, speaking in official-sounding language about property access and legal obligations. After the phone call, Margaret announced that I now faced additional penalties for obstruction of official HOA business and that legal proceedings would begin immediately to compel compliance. She handed me a document that was supposed to be some sort of legal notice, though it looked like something she'd typed up on her home computer and printed on regular paper. The document demanded that I appear at a special hearing to explain my refusal to cooperate with enforcement procedures and warned of severe consequences if I failed to attend. That afternoon, I called the phone number listed on Margaret's supposed legal counsel document. It turned out to be the office of a general practice attorney who had done some routine paperwork for the HOA several years ago, but had never authorized anyone to use his name for enforcement activities. When I explained what Margaret had been doing, the attorney was very clear that the HOA had no legal right to conduct property searches and that the documents she'd been issuing had no legal validity whatsoever. Margaret's next escalation was to involve what she called external enforcement authorities. The following week, her 2 assistants showed up with what appeared to be official-looking uniforms and vehicles, complete with magnetic signs identifying them as community compliance officers. They announced that they were conducting a follow-up investigation based on reports of ongoing violations and demanded immediate access to conduct a comprehensive property assessment. When I refused to allow the inspection, they informed me that I was now subject to citation for interference with official duties and that law enforcement would be contacted to ensure compliance. One of them actually radioed someone using official-sounding codes and terminology to report my non-cooperation. The whole performance was impressive in its attention to detail, but it was still just a performance put on by 2 guys with no actual authority beyond what Margaret had convinced them they possessed. That's when Sarah decided she'd had enough. She had been watching Margaret's escalating campaign from the sidelines, occasionally offering advice, but generally letting me handle what seemed like a neighborhood dispute that would eventually resolve itself. But when 2 strangers in fake uniforms started making demands and threats on our property while our daughter was present, Sarah's law enforcement instincts kicked in and the situation changed completely. Sarah stepped out onto our porch and asked the two men to identify themselves and explain their authority to conduct inspections and issue citations. When they showed her their homemade badges and started reciting their script about HOA enforcement, Sarah quietly asked them if they were aware that impersonating law enforcement officers was a federal crime punishable by up to 3 years in prison. The confident official demeanor they'd been projecting suddenly evaporated as they realized they were no longer dealing with a confused homeowner who might be intimidated by their act. Sarah then informed them that she was a federal agent and that their activities constituted criminal impersonation of public officials. She advised them that they had approximately 30 seconds to leave our property before she called for backup and had them arrested on the spot. The two men looked at each other, looked at Sarah's very real federal credentials, and made the wise decision to retreat to their vehicle without another word. Margaret, who had been waiting in her car at the end of our driveway, apparently realized that her enforcement scheme had just encountered actual law enforcement and decided discretion was the better part of valor. But Margaret wasn't finished yet. Having been outmaneuvered by Sarah's intervention, she decided to involve real authorities herself. The next morning, 2 uniformed police officers knocked on our door with a complaint that had been filed against us for harassment, obstruction of official duties, and violation of community standards. According to the report Margaret had filed, we had threatened her compliance officers with violence and refused to comply with legally mandated property inspections. The officers were professional and thorough in their investigation, but it quickly became clear that Margaret's version of events didn't match the facts. When they asked to see documentation of the legal authority that supposedly required us to submit to inspections, neither Margaret nor her assistants could produce anything legitimate. When they examined the badges and credentials that Margaret's team had been using, the officers immediately recognized them as fake and began asking serious questions about who had authorized their creation and use. Sarah provided the officers with a detailed account of Margaret's escalating harassment campaign, supported by photographs of the fake documents and recordings of some of the more threatening encounters. The officers also interviewed several neighbors who had been subjected to similar treatment and who corroborated our account of Margaret's unauthorized enforcement activities. By the end of their investigation, it was clear that Margaret was the one who had been violating the law, not us. The officers informed Margaret that impersonating law enforcement officers, even at the community level, was a serious crime and that filing false police reports was also a criminal offense. They advised her to cease all enforcement activities immediately and warned that any further complaints based on fabricated violations would result in charges being filed against her. They also confiscated the fake badges and credentials that her assistants had been using and informed them that they could face charges for their participation in the impersonation scheme. Margaret's response to this official intervention was to double down on her authority claims. She contacted the district attorney's office, the state attorney general, and even tried to reach federal authorities to report what she described as interference with legitimate HOA enforcement activities. She claimed that local police had been misled by false information and that higher authorities needed to intervene to protect her rights as a duly elected community representative. None of these appeals went anywhere, but Margaret's persistence in making them created a paper trail that would prove important later. Each agency she contacted forwarded her complaints to the appropriate local authorities, who were already familiar with the situation and who added her continued false reporting to the growing case against her. Margaret was essentially building the prosecution's case for them with every call she made and every document she filed. The situation reached its climax when Margaret decided to organize what she called a community safety intervention. She distributed flyers throughout the neighborhood announcing that emergency measures were being implemented to address ongoing violations and that residents who continued to interfere with enforcement activities would face legal consequences. The flyers included official-looking language about community standards and public safety, and they scheduled a mandatory meeting for all residents to address the compliance crisis. Margaret rented the community center for this meeting and arranged for what she claimed were municipal officials to address the crowd about the importance of HOA compliance. She had somehow convinced a few local business people to attend and speak about property values and community standards, though it was clear they had no idea about the specifics of her enforcement campaign or the legal issues involved. The meeting was Margaret's final performance as HOA president, though she didn't know it at the time. About 50 residents showed up, many of them angry about the harassment they'd been subjected to and ready to demand answers. Margaret opened with a presentation about the importance of community standards and the threat posed by residents who refused to cooperate with legitimate enforcement procedures. She introduced her compliance officers as certified professionals and announced that mandatory inspections would resume the following week. That's when the real authorities arrived. Sarah had been coordinating with local law enforcement throughout Margaret's escalating campaign, and the district attorney's office had decided that Margaret's activities had crossed the line from annoying harassment into criminal behavior. As Margaret was mid-sentence in her presentation about enforcement procedures, 3 police officers entered the community center and approached the front table where she was speaking. The lead officer informed Margaret that she was under arrest for impersonation of a public official, filing false police reports, harassment, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Margaret's reaction was exactly what you'd expect from someone who had convinced herself that she was the legitimate authority in this situation. She demanded to see their authorization, accused them of interfering with official HOA business, and actually tried to order them to leave the meeting immediately. The officers were patient but firm in explaining that Margaret's HOA presidency didn't grant her law enforcement powers and that her creation of fake enforcement officers was a serious crime. They also arrested her 2 assistants who were charged with impersonation and conspiracy. As the 3 of them were being led away in handcuffs, Margaret continued to insist that she was the victim of a conspiracy and that real authorities would vindicate her actions. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and thorough. Margaret was represented by a public defender who tried to argue that her actions were simply overzealous community management rather than criminal behavior. The prosecution, however, had months of evidence documenting Margaret's systematic campaign of harassment and fraud. They presented photographs of the fake badges, recordings of threatening phone calls, and testimony from multiple neighbors who had been subjected to Margaret's enforcement schemes. The most damaging evidence came from Margaret herself. Her meticulous record-keeping, which she had intended to use to justify her enforcement activities, instead provided a comprehensive timeline of her escalating criminal behavior. Her 3-ring binders full of violations and penalties demonstrated a pattern of harassment, while her communications with her fake enforcement officers showed clear evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud. Margaret's trial lasted 3 days and included testimony from more than a dozen neighbors who described her harassment campaign. The prosecution argued that Margaret had systematically abused her position as HOA president to intimidate and financially exploit her neighbors, using fake authority and threats of legal action to extort money through fraudulent fines and penalties. The defense's argument that Margaret was simply trying to maintain community standards was undermined by the evidence of fake badges, false police reports, and unauthorized property searches. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Margaret was sentenced to 18 months in prison, 3 years of probation, and ordered to pay restitution totaling over $12,000 to the neighbors she had harassed and defrauded. She was also permanently banned from holding any position in any homeowners association and required to complete anger management and community service programs. When the judge read the sentence, Margaret's composure finally cracked completely. She stood up in the courtroom and began shouting about the injustice of the proceedings and demanding that higher authorities review the case. She had to be physically restrained by court officers as she continued to insist that she was the real victim, and that everyone involved in her prosecution would face consequences when the truth came out. Even as she was being led away to begin her sentence, Margaret was still trying to assert her authority and threatening legal action against anyone who had opposed her.